Scattered across a shallow coral reef in the middle of the Pacific Ocean sit 92 artificial islands, built from 250,000 tons of stone. The stone came from a quarry 40 kilometers away, on the opposite side of the island. The people who built it had no wheels, no pulleys, no draft animals, and no metal tools capable of shaping it. And after more than a century of study, nobody has ever been able to fully explain how they actually moved it. This is Nan Madol, sitting just off the eastern coast of Pohnpei, a small island in Micronesia, thousands of miles from the nearest continent in almost every direction. Early European explorers who stumbled onto it called it the eighth wonder of the world. Locals call it something closer to a warning, a place between the spaces, half submerged, half swallowed by mangroves, said to be watched over by spirits that do not take kindly to visitors who don't show respect. Between roughly 1200 and 1600 CE, the Saudeleur dynasty, the ruling power that unified and controlled the entire island of Pohnpei, built the city entirely on top of a living coral reef, stacking hundreds of thousands of tons of volcanic stone into walls, tombs, and temples rising directly out of the sea. And then, sometime around 1628, it was abandoned, not gradually forgotten like some ruins, but left behind with enough cultural memory intact that the people of Pohnpei never stopped knowing exactly what it was, or exactly why they were told to stay away from parts of it. This is the story of a city built with a level of engineering ambition that still doesn't have a fully accepted explanation, by a Bronze Age Pacific society with, as far as we know, none of the tools you'd assume you'd need to pull it off. Let's start with the basic geography, because the location alone tells you this wasn't an easy build. Pohnpei is a small volcanic island in the Federated States of Micronesia, roughly 2,000 miles from the Philippines, and even farther from the nearest major landmass in any direction. Nan Madol sits just off its eastern shore, built across an area approximately 1.5 kilometers long and half a kilometer wide, consisting of somewhere around 92 individual artificial islets, separated by a maze of tidal canals, which is exactly why early Western visitors nicknamed it the Venice of the Pacific. The complex includes seawalls, residential platforms, ceremonial temple islets, royal tombs, and, according to oral tradition, even a section functioning as a prison. An entire functioning city, built not on land, but constructed directly on top of a shallow coral reef. The materials used to build it are where the real mystery begins. Nan Madol's walls are not made from local coral limestone, the material you'd expect a reef-adjacent society to use, since it was sitting right there and would have been far easier to source. Instead, the walls are built almost entirely from columnar basalt, a dense volcanic rock that naturally cools into long geometric, mostly hexagonal or pentagonal rods, similar in appearance to the famous Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, except quarried, transported, and deliberately stacked by human hands, rather than left where volcanic activity originally formed it. These naturally occurring basalt columns range from roughly 5 to 20 feet in length, and the builders of Nan Madol use them the way a modern construction crew might use pre-cut structural beams, laying them in alternating crisscross patterns, sometimes called a header-stretcher technique, to interlock successive layers into walls that in places rise as high as 25 feet, with some sections reportedly reaching 50 feet, and walls up to 16 feet thick. The largest and most impressive of these structures is Nandawa's, the Royal Mortuary Complex, where the outer walls stand 25 feet tall, enclosing an area larger than a football field. A single cornerstone at its base is estimated to weigh around 50 tons. Across the wider site, researchers estimate the total volume of basalt used in construction at somewhere around 250,000 tons, an almost unimaginable quantity of stone to move, shape, and stack using nothing but manual labor, watercraft, and whatever rope or lever systems the builders devised on their own, since no evidence of wheels, pulleys, block and tackle systems, or draft animals capable of hauling this kind of weight has ever been found anywhere in the region's archaeological record. Here's the detail that makes this genuinely difficult to explain. The basalt used throughout Nan Madol didn't come from anywhere near the construction site. Geochemical sourcing studies matching the stone's mineral signature to known volcanic formations have traced the material back to quarry sites located on the completely opposite side of Pohnpei, meaning workers had to extract these multi-ton columns from inland volcanic vents, move them across the island's interior or around its coastline, and then transport them across open water to the specific reef location where Nan Madol was being constructed, a journey covering roughly 40 kilometers by the most direct routes available. Local oral tradition offers its own explanation, and it's worth hearing, even though it isn't the kind of answer modern engineering can verify. According to Pohnpeian legend, Nan Madol was created by two brothers, Olosopa and Olosipa, who arrived on the island searching for a place to build an altar to worship Naneson Sapf, a god associated with agriculture. The brothers, according to the story, used magic to lift the massive basalt stones into the air and fly them directly to the construction site, stacking them into place without ever needing to physically drag them across land or water at all. Some versions of the story describe the stones as flying under their own power once properly enchanted, essentially building the walls of Nan Madol through supernatural force rather than manual labor. Modern researchers obviously don't treat levitating stones as a literal engineering explanation, but the persistence of this specific legend, across many generations of oral history, tells us something important. Even the descendants of the people who most plausibly built this site found the physical achievement so implausible, using the technology their own ancestors would have had access to, that the explanation which survived in cultural memory involved magic rather than logistics. That's not typically how oral traditions describe engineering projects. Their ancestors' own generation actually understood and carried out through ordinary hard labor. It's closer to how oral traditions tend to describe something that even the people living closest to the event found difficult to fully explain in practical terms. Carbon dating conducted on coral fragments used as leveling material within the site's foundations has helped establish a construction timeline. The earliest confirmed monument building activity at Nan Madol dates to around 1180 CE, with the most intense phase of megalithic construction occurring between approximately 1200 and 1600 CE. This lines up with the broader rise of the Saudeleur dynasty, the centralized political and religious authority that unified Pohnpei under a single ruling structure, using Nan Madol as its ceremonial, administrative, and mortuary capital. The site itself is organized into two distinct sectors. Pohnpei, in the southwest, functioned as the administrative center, where the ruling elite conducted the practical business of governing the island. Pohnpei, in the northeast, served as the religious and mortuary sector, comprising 58 separate islets, most of which were inhabited specifically by priests responsible for maintaining the site's ceremonial functions. This division suggests a genuinely stratified, organized society, one sophisticated enough to separate religious authority from administrative governance across physically distinct sections of the same city, connected but functionally separated by water. Understanding the Saudeleur dynasty's political structure helps explain why a project of this scale was even attempted in the first place. Unlike many other Pacific Island societies of the same general era, which tended to remain organized around smaller, independent chiefdoms, the Saudeleur achieved something unusual. They unified the entire island of Pohnpei under a single centralized ruling authority, maintained continuously for roughly 5 centuries according to oral tradition. That kind of sustained, centralized political control is exactly the type of social organization capable of coordinating a multi-generational megalithic construction project, mobilizing labor, resources, and logistics across an entire island population year after year, in a way a collection of smaller, competing chiefdoms typically could not sustain. The spiritual reputation surrounding Nan Madol today isn't a modern tourist invention layered onto the ruins after the fact. It reflects a continuous living tradition among Pohnpeians, who have maintained specific customs and cautions around the site for generations. Certain sections, particularly the royal mortuary complex at Nandawas, are treated with genuine reverence and caution by local residents, tied to the belief that the spirits of the Saudeleur rulers and the priests who once served them continue to inhabit the site. Visitors are traditionally advised to ask permission before entering certain areas, and stories persist locally about misfortune befalling people who have treated the ruins disrespectfully or attempted to remove artifacts from the site without proper regard for these customs. Whether or not you find the specific supernatural claims credible, the consistency and seriousness with which this belief has been maintained across generations, in a location with genuinely unusual, unexplained engineering behind it, adds an entire additional layer to why Nan Madol continues to captivate people well beyond its purely archaeological significance. Now, here's where things get stranger, because the identity of the people who actually built all of this doesn't cleanly match what you'd expect from a civilization capable of this level of engineering. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests Pohnpei's earliest inhabitants descended from the Lapita, a seafaring people originally connected to the Philippines, who spread throughout the Pacific and eventually mixed with local populations across Micronesia. Pottery fragments recovered near Nan Madol match known Lapita styles, and a nearby rock art gallery features carvings strikingly similar to petroglyphs found in New Caledonia, more than 3,000 kilometers away, supporting a documented cultural connection across an enormous stretch of open ocean. But here's the inconsistency that puzzles researchers. The Lapita, based on the wider archaeological record across the Pacific, are not otherwise known for advanced monumental stone architecture on anything close to this scale. Their broader cultural signature, found across dozens of Pacific Island sites, involves seafaring skill, distinctive pottery, and small-scale settlement, not megalithic engineering projects, moving hundreds of thousands of tons of quarried stone. That gap between what we know about the broader Lapita cultural tradition and what actually exists at Nan Madol is a big part of why the site remains so difficult to fully explain. Either Pohnpei's specific branch of this culture developed an entirely unique engineering tradition unmatched anywhere else in their known cultural range, driven by circumstances specific to this one island that we don't fully understand, or there are still significant gaps in the archaeological record connecting Nan Madol's builders to a broader technical tradition that simply hasn't been fully documented yet, perhaps lost through the same limited written record that leaves so much of Pacific Island history dependent on oral tradition rather than surviving text. Let's talk about daily life within the completed city. Because Nan Madol wasn't purely ceremonial, even though its religious function dominates most modern discussion of the site. The canal system running between the 92 islets served a genuinely practical transportation function, allowing canoes to move between different sections of the city on a schedule tied to the tides, since water depth in the shallow channels shifted significantly between high and low tide. It functioned as an actual working urban center with practical infrastructure supporting the ordinary logistics of feeding, housing, and organizing the priests, administrators, and laborers who lived and worked there across 4 centuries of continuous use. The scale of stone transport required to sustain construction across that entire period compounds the mystery further. This wasn't a single dramatic building event completed in one generation. Carbon dating places the earliest monument construction around 1180 CE, with intensive megalithic building continuing for roughly 400 years afterward, meaning successive generations of Pohnpeian laborers maintained and expanded this same complex quarry trip after quarry trip, generation after generation, using whatever transportation method they'd developed, without that method ever apparently being significant enough to survive in detailed written or clearly preserved technical oral tradition, separate from the more symbolic legend of the flying stones. Easter Island's Moai statues, weighing up to several tons each, were moved several miles using a rocking, walking technique that researchers have since successfully replicated in modern experiments. Nan Madol's basalt columns, by contrast, required transport across roughly 40 kilometers that included a significant open water crossing, using multi-ton stone with no comparable trackway evidence and no successful modern experimental replication of the specific technique involved, at a greater combined scale of total material move than either of those other famous megalithic mysteries. Let's talk about what finally ended it, because unlike some ancient sites, Nan Madol's decline is actually reasonably well documented through oral history, even without a written record from the Saudeleur period itself. According to Pohnpeian oral tradition, the Saudeleur dynasty's rule eventually became oppressive enough that it provoked open rebellion, culminating in an invasion led by a semi-legendary warrior figure named Isokelekele, who is said to have overthrown the Saudeleur rulers around 1628 and established a new political system on Pohnpei, one organized around a decentralized network of local chiefs, rather than the centralized authority the Saudeleurs had maintained from Nan Madol. Following this political transition, Nan Madol's role as the island's central seat of power came to an end. The site wasn't violently destroyed or erased. It was gradually abandoned as political authority shifted elsewhere on the island, left to the slow processes of tidal erosion, mangrove overgrowth, and encroaching silt that continue to threaten its structural integrity today. That combination of factors, siltation clogging the original canal systems and mangrove roots physically working their way into and destabilizing centuries-old stone walls, became serious enough that in 2016, when Nan Madol was formally inscribed as Micronesia's first UNESCO World Heritage Site, it was simultaneously placed on the list of World Heritage in Danger, an official acknowledgement that the site faces genuine, ongoing risk of further deterioration without significant conservation intervention. The specific threats facing Nan Madol today are worth understanding in their own right, because they illustrate just how fragile even a structure built from hundreds of thousands of tons of stone can ultimately be. Rising sea levels and increasingly severe tropical storms, both linked to broader climate change, affecting low-lying Pacific Island nations generally, pose a direct physical threat to a site built essentially at sea level, dependent on tidal flow, through channels that were engineered for conditions 4 centuries ago rather than today's shifting baseline. Mangrove trees, which were largely absent from the immediate area when Nan Madol was originally constructed and occupied, have since colonized much of the site, their root systems gradually prying apart carefully stacked basalt walls that have otherwise withstood centuries of tropical storms and tidal action without mortar of any kind holding them together. Conservation teams working with Micronesian heritage authorities and international partners have been documenting the site extensively and exploring stabilization techniques. But the remote location, limited local infrastructure, and sheer physical scale of the ruins make comprehensive preservation a genuinely difficult, resource-intensive undertaking, one that international heritage funding has only partially been able to address so far. So here's where the honest picture actually lands. We know with reasonable confidence who built Nan Madol, when they built it, and roughly why it was eventually abandoned. The Saudeleur dynasty constructed it as a centralized seat of religious and administrative power, maintained it for roughly 4 centuries, and lost control of it following a political uprising that oral tradition preserved in enough detail to give us an actual named figure, Isokalakel, connected to its downfall. What we still do not have a fully accepted answer for is the actual engineering. 250,000 tons of basalt, quarried 40 kilometers from where it was ultimately used, moved and stacked by a society with no documented wheels, no pulley systems, and no large domesticated animals capable of hauling that kind of weight. The oral tradition passed down by the very descendants of the people who most plausibly accomplished this credits the achievement to flying, magically animated stones rather than ordinary human labor and logistics, which either reflects the understandable erosion of practical engineering knowledge over centuries of oral retelling, or reflects just how genuinely implausible this accomplishment looked, even to the people living closest to it, once the specific techniques involved were no longer commonly practiced or remembered in detail. Modern engineers and archaeologists have proposed various logistics using rafts, log rollers, and coordinated seasonal labor tied to the tides, and these remain the most credible working theories. But nobody has definitively demonstrated, through direct evidence, exactly how it was done, and the gap between Nan Madol's engineering achievement and the broader, otherwise well-documented cultural tradition of the Lapita people, who most plausibly built it, remains a genuine unresolved puzzle in Pacific archaeology. What's left today is a slowly sinking, slowly silting mangrove-choked complex of stone islands, listed as a World Heritage Site in danger, visited by a small trickle of travelers willing to make the long journey to one of the most remote inhabited islands on Earth. Locals still treat parts of the site with real, serious caution, and stories of restless spirits guarding its tombs remain part of everyday cultural memory on Pohnpei today, not distant folklore, but a living tradition still shaping how people interact with the ruins. So we want to ask you directly, do you think Nan Madol's builders had a logistics system history simply failed to record? Or is there something about this specific engineering achievement that still doesn't add up? Leave your theory in the comments below. We read every one of them. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the kind hiding at the edge of the map, half swallowed by the sea and still not fully explained, make sure you're subscribed, because next time we're heading somewhere just as remarkable. Until then, stay curious and keep questioning the version of history you were handed.